With it being July 4th, I figured, why don't we have a more America-themed episode today? I love this country. I love the red, white, and blue. I love the Star-Spangled Banner, football, baseball, apple pie, cowboys and Indians, Miami Vice, quintessential Americana. But if there's something that I love just as much as this country, it's the people in it. And more specifically, the people that serve this country and protect our rights every day. One of those people in particular is Brian Stann, the most American UFC fighter to ever live. He was born on September 24th of 1980 in Fusa, Tokyo, Japan, on an air base, quite literally born into the military. His family would move back to Scranton, Pennsylvania, go Birds, and he'd grow up there, go to prep school, eventually enroll in the Naval Academy. That's where he would get the best base for MMA you can get, football. As you can see on the screen, we have several great representatives of the football to MMA pipeline, including the GOAT OSP. And then after his football years, he'd be assigned to the Marines, which is actually the second best base for MMA, as you can see on the screen, with people like Jack Marshman and Jorge Rivera, if you remember him. Lieutenant Stann, who can most closely be represented by a real-life Captain America. I mean, look at the guy. And you know what's crazy? I'll get into it later, but I'm pretty sure this is like 100% natural, which is crazy. I know it sounds crazy, but we'll get into it. He would be put into the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, and he would be in charge of the 2nd Mobile Assault Platoon. His services would be used in Operation Matador, where the platoon that he was leading would be ambushed at the Ramana Bridge. He held out for 6 days under heavy attack, May 8th through May 14th, 2005. All 42 of the Marines in Brian Stann's platoon survived, and he was awarded the Silver Star for his bravery. Naturally, after surviving such an ordeal, he would begin an MMA career in 2006 while still being active duty, where he would use his accumulated leave to take time off to train in between fights and then fight. His MMA career would start against Aaron Stark. Chael Sonnen was on the commentary, and honestly, the takeaway from this first fight is he has the death touch. As you can tell from his physique, the guy can punch hard. His next fight would be Miguel Cosio, get a 16-second knockout, and Cosio would go on to be 1-13 in his career, so maybe not the most difficult opponent to get, but he was only 1-0, so I'm not mad at him for taking a fight against another opponent who was 0-1. Up next, he'd go against Steve Cantwell, and we're going to talk about this guy a bit in the video. And he'd go into this fight. This was a very even matchup, and he just put him out quick. He would just hammer him. He'd beat him up. But the stoppage was a bit early, and he landed some shots to the back of the head. I'm not above admitting that Brian Stann accidentally punched a guy in the back of the head, but I don't think that really changed the outcome of the fight. He was on him like white on rice. It was like a fireman trying to put out a fire. The next fight, he would go up against Craig Zellner. And let's just say Craig Zellner wanted to put himself apart from the rest of the opponents. He was trying to talk trash to the Silver Star winning American hero. Okay, bro. Okay, if you think that's going to help, go ahead, I guess. But this was hydrogen bomb coughing baby, because Craig Zellner, he might have had some experience going into the fight, but this dude pulled guard like 6 times, which is hilarious because he didn't pull guard in a way where it was strategic, like Paul Craig. He gets in and he's pulling guard on, like he would go for a takedown and just get stopped and be like, okay, I'm pulling guard. I'm pulling guard immediately. Well, Brian Stann bonked him on the head, put him out in the first round. So that is now 4 first-round finishes in a row. In his next fight, Jeremiah Billington. Let's just say this fight shouldn't have happened. I don't care that he was 10-1. I'm sure he had self-belief. This dude was 5'8" and 195 pounds for a light heavyweight fight. He was also talking a little smack in that opening vignette that they do, but Brian Stann put the beats on him. He put the beats on him and put him away, and he just bullied him. Like, it wasn't even a competitive fight. The next fight would be Doug Marshall, and this is the championship fight for the light heavyweight championship in the WEC. Once again, this was Rock'em Sock'em Robots, right? Brian Stann's fights were never super technical in the WEC. He'd come out, throw heavy leather, and when he caught him, they'd go down. This fight, Doug took a couple punches, Stann took a couple punches. He landed, like, the type of stuff that your coach shows you, this is the type of check hook you're trying to land. That's the type of lead hook that he landed to put Doug Marshall down. Like, seriously, if you're trying to figure out how to generate power on your lead hook, man, just watch this. It's a prime example. Obviously, you got to have some meat on you to get power like that, but still. Now, I said this guy would come back up. Then he had a rematch against Steve Cantwell for the light heavyweight championship, and this time Cantwell came out and was just pure technique. Brian Stann was a bowling ball, and Steve Cantwell was the matador. In this fight, Cantwell really kind of put the beats on him, the way that Brian Stann was putting the beats on everyone else, but there was that clear lack of power compared to Brian Stann. When Brian Stann was doing it, people were going down. Steve Cantwell, in the first round, he hurt him, because these guys are still light heavyweights. He hurt him a couple times, but it took until the end of the second round where Brian Stann was gassed out after throwing big right hands, really just kind of throwing 1-2s a lot and some hooks. Steve Cantwell landed a good right hand that rocked him enough that when he fell face down and Cantwell jumped on top, started landing ground and pound. Ref stepped in. It was a good win. Brian Stann, just like an absolute gentleman, grabbed the belt to put the belt on him as they announced him the winner. And then he gave him a hug from behind, which caused this picture right here, which, let's be real, this picture is like, it's a little weird, but that's just sportsmanship. After this fight, they would be moving on to the UFC. Both of them. They'd get signed. And they'd be booked to fight one another. But Brian Stann had to pull out due to injury. It caused a rebooking where Cantwell went and fought somebody else, and Brian Stann got another fight against a familiar face. Krzysztof Sosinski, a guy that Brian Stann had trained with. Now, the Polish Experiment, this guy rocks. He went on, he did some movies. I think this guy's really cool. I've always been a big fan of his fights whenever I watched him on Fight Pass. I don't think I've ever watched him fight live once. But in hindsight, he seems like a really cool guy. He seems really nice too. Well, him and Brian, they'd get their duel on, and first off, Brian Stann, his biggest weakness for the rest of his career was exposed this fight. Brian Stann, all the freedom flowing through his bones, that red, white, and blue DNA he has, he wants to stand and bang. Brian Stann wants to throw punches. He wants to kick. He wants it to be a fight. His takedown defense is okay, but once he's on the ground, Brian Stann is in a different world, and that's exactly what Krzysztof did this fight. They had trained together. I think Krzysztof knew. He didn't play around on the feet too much. Blasted a double leg, got him up, dropped him to the ground, and when they were sprawling and doing their scrambles, which actually were pretty fun to watch, Brian Stann pulled the old Derek Lewis just stand up defense a couple of times. Sosinski got it a half, went into side, and just put that Kimura way to his shoulder blade. If Brian Stann didn't tap, that thing was going to pop out of the socket. It was a good win by Krzysztof, but this was the first real chink in the armor for Brian Stann, because the other fight looked like inexperience, but this was now 2 losses in a row, including his debut into the new promotion. So it wasn't looking too good for Brian. Then finally, we have the trilogy that everyone, and I mean everyone, was waiting for. When people talk about trilogies in UFC history, they need to bring up Brian Stann versus Steve Cantwell. Now, I know it's not just UFC history, it's WEC, but if we're going to count for the knockout record and everything, WEC and, finish record for Cowboy, we can count the fights in WEC, and this was a trilogy that did not necessarily live up to the hype of the other two fights. Other two fights were barn burners that ended early. This fight went to decision, and from the pictures you'd think it was a barn burner, but honestly, like, Brian Stann came in and fought smart. He was bouncy and light on his feet. He countered a lot and he was backing up. He was really just waiting for his good shots to come to him instead of forcing it by being that bull in a china shop, and he won the decision. I personally think he won the decision. The commentators did not. It is what it is, but at the end of the day, this was a win that he needed, and he would take with him onto his next fight. His fight against Rodney Wallace. Rodney, show enough, the Master Wallace. First off, what the heck? Weirdest nickname I've heard in a while. He came out with his corner dressed exactly like him. He was a 3-time state wrestling champ, so he had that background that caused Brian Stann trouble. And they go in and he took him down. I mean, he was flip-flopping him around. Like, Rodney Wallace has no fights he needed to be doing all that in. 0-3 in the UFC, by the way. But Rodney Wallace would throw him around, and Brian Stann would just get back up. Because Brian Stann can't stop the takedown, but he can get up at least. He would get up, and he would get up, and he would get up till he would win an uneventful decision because Rodney Wallace didn't really do any damage. And whenever Brian Stann would sweep or get on top, I mean, he would actually work. So good ground and pound from Brian Stann. Like, he has really good ground and pound considering how bad he is defensively on the ground. And then the next fight. I mean, they knew what they were doing when they made this fight. In the intro, they literally address it where Brian Stann's like, yeah, people think I'm just going to come out here and be a cupcake for Phil Davis to get by. Yeah, man, that's what they wanted. And Phil Davis was debuting. He had the Penn State wrestling background, and this is just a terrible matchup. And you think the UFC would treat an American hero better. And Phil Davis would pretty much control him the whole fight. It was not competitive. This fight is terrible. I watch every single one of the fights that I talk about on here for every single fighter. This fight is a Mark DeCasey masterclass. That's what this is. It's a Mark DeCasey masterclass. Except Phil Davis doing it is more respectable because Phil Davis is a wrestler. Like, he doesn't have that other skill set really. And this was his debut. So, absolutely dominates Brian Stann. Hurt to watch. And then Brian Stann realizes, maybe I'm a bit too small for light heavyweight. So he'd make his way down to middleweight, and he'd debut against Mike Mazzenzio. And this fight is hilarious. Mazzenzio is a wrestler. He doesn't have much to offer besides that. Brian Stann, struggling to stop it. He would get his own sweeps, and he'd get his own takedowns, and get some success. But he'd win the fight by a triangle off of his back that Joe Rogan literally coached him through. They need to investigate this. I love Brian Stann. I don't really dislike Joe Rogan, but they need to investigate this. Joe Rogan talked him through how to put the triangle on. Brian Stann gets it on, wins his first fight by submission in his middleweight debut, and then calls out Chris Lieben. Not after the fight, but in general, calls out Chris Lieben because he wants him. And Chris Lieben was a menace at this time. But I get it. I think he was just tired of fighting wrestlers. He wanted to fight a guy that was going to stand up with him. So he gets his fight with Chris Lieben and wrecks him, dominates him, just like bullies him. He's a big man. I mean, he was having Chris Lieben falling around everywhere. Who does that to Chris Lieben? Who does that to Chris Lieben besides everyone after this fight? It was a good win, and that gave him a lot of momentum going into his next fight at middleweight against Jorge Santiago. And apparently, Jorge Santiago was this big guy in Japan. He was coming over, returning to the UFC, and Brian Stann was welcoming him in. And somehow this got fight of the night. I don't know why. Like, this fight's okay. Like, that's another thing. Like, investigate this. This is money laundering. How did he get fight of the night for this performance? It was one-sided. He dropped him a couple times. I mean, it was a good finish. Maybe it got fight of the night. Maybe there was a bunch of hype around Santiago at the time. Once again, this was before I had started watching. So maybe there's a bunch of hype around Santiago that gave Brian Stann a fight of the night just for beating him like regularly. I don't know. Like nothing special about this fight. And next, Brian Stann would be put up against another wrestler, but this time an elite wrestler. He was being put up against Chael Sonnen after the first Anderson Silva fight when people were thinking that Chael was the next guy. Chael had a 14-month layoff. They got matched up against each other. The fight went how you think. It went how you think. Chael just ragdolled him, and it wasn't that competitive. Brian Stann landed a couple things on the feet when they were standing, but Chael took him down at will, ended up getting an arm triangle, and then this would lead to the iconic post-fight interview where Chael would go, "Anderson Silva, you absolutely suck," and everybody loses their mind. So a little bit of UFC history embedded within Brian's career. Alessio Sakara would be next on the docket, and let's just say Alessio Sakara is not good. He isn't, but he's Italian and he has the look of a good fighter. So they put him up against Brian Stann, and the Sopranos were not there to help Alessio because Brian Stann would sit in full guard and put his lights out. And how often do you see that in the UFC or just MMA in general? No matter what promotion, Cage Warriors, Octagon, like Legacy, all these promotions, how many times are guys getting knocked out in full guard? It's insane. There's a good win. It showed Brian Stann's power, but Alessio was definitely one of the worst people Brian Stann ever fought. Even back for like WEC days, I feel like this guy, he just sat there and let himself get beat up. But it was a good bounce back win that he needed before he would get matched up against Michael Bisping, who, little fun fact about this fight was between two guys that had been born on military bases. Not a lot of people know, but Michael Bisping was born in Cyprus on a military base, the same way that Brian Stann was born in Japan on a military base. I just thought that was fun when I was doing the research, and this fight would be pretty good. It didn't get fight of the night. I liked it a lot, though. This was Michael Bisping's last fight before he lost his eye to Vitor Belfort, so this is the last time we got to see 2020 vision Michael Bisping. And these fighters were looking at Brian Stann like Ngannou because Michael Bisping took this guy down. Michael Bisping did pretty good on the feet. I mean, if you look at the stats, like, it was a very even fight. Michael Bisping was just jabbing his head off. But Michael Bisping had to take Brian Stann down. What is going on? Even Michael Bisping took him down. And it would end up being that's one of the better fights in his tenure because it was competitive with a guy that, as we know now, Michael Bisping is an elite talent. Back then, this is when people were looking at him as a gatekeeper. But in actuality, this fight, it was kind of Brian Stann being the gatekeeper, losing to Bisping after Bisping lost a controversial decision to Chael Sonnen. And then Brian Stann would move on to the final fight of his career. In Saitama, Japan, at the Saitama Super Arena, Brian Stann would take on Wanderlei Silva. This would be a homecoming for both men. Wanderlei Silva making his name in Japan with pride as one of the most violent men in the history of MMA, and Brian Stann returning home to where he was born. This main event was fireworks. They came out with one thing in mind: get the knockout. That first round was incredible. Brian Stann dropped Wanderlei about 3 times, and Wanderlei still responded towards the end of the round with a right hand that put Stann down. Stann would manage his way into top position and would just be bleeding all over Wanderlei. It was back and forth nonstop, and it was perfect because they were landing groin shots. And if you think about it, a lot of the best fights ever, they have a groin shot in there because that groin shot lets them get their energy back, and then they start going out throwing haymakers again. So just keep an eye out. Keep an eye out. For some of the best fights ever, there's normally a groin shot in them. Second round would come, and then Vanderlei would end it towards the end of the round. They were much more measured in this second round, and Vanderlei landed a big left hand after he stunned him with a right, dropped Bryan to the ground, and then he put him out, like put his lights out with some ground and pound, which, good moment for Vanderlei, tough moment for Bryan. And Bryan would decide to call it a career. And he'd move into a broadcasting role with the UFC, and this might be a hot take. Brian Stann is the best commentator the UFC has ever had. I'll say it. He's at least the best fighter turned commentator that the UFC's ever had. Brian Stann is amazing. A lot of those fights, when you go back and listen to him back on the UFC on Fox days, when you go back and listen to him commentate, it is a breath of fresh air than the stuff we get now, than the stuff that we were getting then. Like, I love Goldberg. Listen, Goldie, he wasn't always perfect. Joe Rogan is not always perfect. John Anik is pretty good, but sometimes John Anik is not perfect. Brian Stann, I can't remember not liking anytime he commentated a fight. He did such a good job. And part of it's how well-spoken he is. A very well-spoken guy. And then he'd move on to work with the PFL because he'd leave the UFC's commentating and everything, going into real estate. And then the PFL option came up. And we have a picture of him with somebody. We're not going to talk about it. I don't want to get my blood pressure up. But he'd be with the PFL, and he still does a ton of charity work for veterans. He has a foundation, everything. He's an all-around American, all-around great guy. And that's why it's with my pleasure that I am inducting, and I know it's 2 for 2 on videos, I'm inducting Brian Stann into the journeyman wing of the Buffalo MMA Hall of Fame. I didn't expect to get another entrant, I should say, already, but this guy was a great gatekeeper journeyman. He beat everyone he was supposed to, with the exception of maybe Krzysztof Soizinski. But like everybody else, like he was beating the guys he was supposed to beat, and the guys that he lost to ended up being great. His losses in the UFC are Phil Davis, Chael Sonnen, Michael Bisping, Vanderlei Silva, Krzysztof Soizinski, but that was his debut against the guy he trained against, so I'll look away from that. He lost against contenders, and then everybody he was supposed to beat, he beat. So that's 2 entrants into our journeyman wing of the Buffalo MMA Hall of Fame. Hopefully we can get some into a different wing soon. But honestly, this is the most American fighter in UFC history, and it was a pleasure talking about him. Go back, watch some of his fights on Fight Pass. Just a fighter's fighter. A lot of athleticism put into that octagon, and it showed with his highlights. It was a pleasure. Hope all of you have a good day. Buffalo MMA signing out.